We have more breaking news tonight. Sources say State Department spokeswoman Heather Nauert is expected to be nominated as the next American ambassador to the United Nations. Nauert is a former Fox News anchor and has been serving as the State Department spokesperson. Joining me now is David Gergen, who served in 4 administrations. On the phone, Jen Psaki, who herself was a State Department spokeswoman under the President Obama, and CNN chief media correspondent Brian Stelter. David, I'm wondering, first of all, what your reaction is to this reporting, given basically her background is she was at ABC as a correspondent for a while, but mostly at Fox News.
Well, she looks like she has a fine resume as a journalist. She distinguished herself on ABC, Fox News and then she was a co-anchor for Fox and Friends. So she has big credentials at Fox. In terms of what we normally look for at the United Nations, her resume is very thin. Her experience in diplomacy is non-existent, as best I can tell. She is a spokesperson for this Trump White House. But traditionally, Anderson, we've either had people with a lot of experience in international affairs and or a lot of experience as academics. You think of Adlai Stevenson as a UN ambassador under John Kennedy, or Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was there under Nixon, or Madeleine Albright, who was there, or the list goes on. Jeane Kirkpatrick, who was there under Reagan. Normally, from a White House standpoint, from a State Department standpoint, you're not looking at the UN job strictly as a communications job. You're looking at it as a place where we conduct active diplomacy with nations around the world, and that supplements what happens at the State Department itself, normally, when we at any administration I've worked with, we call the ambassador to the United Nations and say, help us understand what world opinion is like. What would you recommend as in terms of policy? I don't see that happening here.
Yeah, I mean, Jen, you talk about Jeane Kirkpatrick, whether you agree with her policies or not. I mean, she was an intellectual powerhouse with extensive writings. Is Nauert qualified for the role of UN ambassador?
Yeah, I think a lot of what David said I absolutely agree with. I mean, there's no question Heather has briefed effectively representing the views of the president, but that's not what this job is. That's, in fact, a small sliver, a tiny sliver of this job. And the most important part really happens behind the scenes, because historically, and in recent time as well, this role has been a person who has really been meeting with other UN ambassadors, who often are the highest level right before foreign secretaries from other countries. They're negotiating deals behind the scenes. They're really on the front lines of diplomacy for the United States. And they've also historically been the leaders unofficially of kind of the diplomatic corps. So this is a risky move for Trump, because this is a role now that probably will not be taken at that level of seriousness by other UN ambassadors, and it really diminishes the effectiveness of our role of the UN ambassador in New York.
Brian, another way to look at this is just through the lens of this is another example in a number of examples of the kind of extraordinary relationships between Fox News and this administration.
Yes, and that merger that we've seen between Fox and Trump, it may be good for Trump personally. It might make him feel more comfortable with the staff around him, but I don't think it's good for America. The look at the way he's recruited, not just Heather Nauert, but others in his administration as well, recruiting via television.
Bill Shine, who was executive
Bill
there
Shine being a great
Bolton.
example. Obviously, I love television, but it may not be the best way to recruit leaders for the country. And you mentioned Bill Shine. There's an interesting connection here. Shine worked with Nauert for many years at Fox. David Gergen was talking about Nauert as a journalist. I think that's a fair characterization, but I think it's maybe better to call her a professional pundit. She was wanting to be a talking head in the 90s as a 20-something. She was a consultant and a lobbyist briefly, but really she just really wanted to be on television. She worked at that for years. She was on a number of conservative talk shows. And then, as David mentioned, Fox and Friends was that main job she had before going over to the State Department. So it is a very unusual resume indeed for this job.
David Nauert's predecessor, Nikki Haley, differed, it seemed, from the president on a number of matters, certainly in tone and tenor, particularly when it came to Russia. It will be very interesting to see how Nauert navigates, what are very tricky waters.
Absolutely, and I do think, going back to any comparison you want to make, that Nikki Haley was she didn't have a lot of experience in diplomacy, but what she brought to that job, which was very important, was she had a very close relationship with the president. And she could represent people when they talked to her at the UN, knew that she was in effect talking for people in the White House, and it gave her credibility. And she's one of the few people who's come out of the administration with her credentials enhanced. But again, two people I left off the list earlier. Think of Dick Holbrooke, how much experience he had when he went there, or think of Samantha Power, who just came out of the Obama administration. Didn't have a lot of experience in diplomacy, but had a Pulitzer Prize, on the serious issues regarding genocide, and was regarded as a human rights specialist and champion across the world. Usually when you appoint your UN person, that is somebody you might think eventually could become Secretary of State. Can you imagine that? In this case, I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, Jen, the president has made it clear he doesn't really think very highly of the UN. I mean, there was that awkward moment back in September during his speech at the General Assembly. I just want to play part of that.
My administration has accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country. America's so true. Didn't expect that reaction, but that's okay.
Jen, I mean, do we have any idea at this point how Nauert feels about the UN as an institution?
I don't think we know that, though I will say that there's been certainly a change in the dynamics of the national security team since the appointment of Nikki Haley. Obviously, she was on the front end, but now you have Ambassador Bolton in there, who is, by all accounts, a hard-charging, somebody with 3 decades of experience, who, if he not supported the Nauert nomination, he might be thinking, I could control her. Whether that's true or not, we'll see. This is a role that typically reports also technically to the Secretary of State, so Pompeo may also be thinking that. So what's we don't know at this point, but you can kind of guess, given the personalities of these players, is that there's been a push to have somebody in this role that maybe the other national security players could control or could kind of move in their direction, given how much things have changed on the team.
All right, Jen Psaki, David Gergen, Brian Stelter, thanks very much.